on documentation. Welcome to week 2 of Accounting 341 Summer 2020. So in this chapter we're going to talk about documenting and data modeling, the importance of documentation, and types of documentation used by accountants, including flowcharts, data flow diagrams, business process charts. We'll mostly look at data flow diagrams. We'll focus on data flow diagrams. We'll talk about flowcharts a little bit later in the course. We get to some of the internal control chapters. So you will prepare a DFD. You'll recreate one. There's a DFD at the end of this presentation, which I've uploaded to Blackboard. It's in a PDF file, so you will basically recreate two data flow diagrams, what we call a context and a level 0 data flow diagram. So for this week, just to review, you'll need to finish the manual system assignment. I do have a PowerPoint help document and a video to help you in finishing that project. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always contact me via email. Then there's a DFD assignment, which would be pretty easy. It's the end of this presentation. I would recommend using PowerPoint. You can use Word or Visio. I think PowerPoint's quite a bit easier to use than Word for preparing data flow diagrams and flow charts in general. Visio is pretty easy to use as well, but not everyone has that. Of course, you know that you can download for free the Microsoft Suite. If you have a PC or if you have a Mac, you can download I think theirs might be, for the Mac, might be a little bit older version. You can download, Microsoft software for the Mac as well. So for this week, we got the manual system, DFD assignment, 2 My Educator lessons, and discussion board. So a busy week. Of those assignments, the most time consuming will be the manual system. So set some time aside to do that. It is worth 75 points, almost as much as an exam, but it is a very helpful assignment, and I do have a video on that you might want to watch. It's a very helpful assignment to help you, I think, sort of review the accounting system and how accounting documentation works within that accounting system, what kind of data audit trail we have in an accounting system. So take a look at that. Take a look at the video and the PowerPoint presentation, and then complete that as best you can. You should be able to do a good job, though. All right, and then there is a discussion board on documentation, and so that's up as well. All right, so make at least one post in the discussion board, and those are generally, I think, worth about 5 points. I believe they're worth about 5 points a pop. Okay, maybe a little more. So documentation overview. Questions to be addressed in this chapter include: why do we do documentation? What's the purpose of documentation? Of course, to document our work. Why do we do that? Well, it can be used for training. It can be used to understand internal control. It can be used to understand a system. It can be used to design a new system. So a lot of reasons why we would document. For auditors, I think the main reason would be to try to understand what's going on with internal control and see whether they can improve some of the internal control processes that are in place. So why do accountants need to understand documentation? They're actually required to understand documentation if they're an auditor by SOX, PCAOB, and some other auditing standards. But also, so that's okay, you need to do it because the authorities tell you need to do it, but then beyond that, it is very helpful in learning about internal control, learning about systems, learning, training employees, being trained, and so forth. And we'll talk about that in a second. What techniques are used in accounting systems? We're going to talk about flowcharts a little bit, data flow diagrams, and business process charts. But mostly we're going to focus in this presentation on data flow diagrams. All right, and then we'll kind of compare the two, data flow diagrams and flowcharts, and how to prepare those. So here are some types of documentation. This is not an all-inclusive list, but narratives, flowcharts, business process charts or diagrams, and then other written materials, charts, graphs, etc. that you might see from data visualization software. Right? Some of you have used Tableau. You're going to use IDEA. They have a lot of documentation that you can use from those programs. So in IDEA, for instance, when you if you use IDEA, or if you use IDEA when you get to the workforce, you will be able to create some charts and graphs tables, so forth, we can use that. I mean, that can count as documentation as well to help people learn about control or learn about the system or learn about how to use a system. Accountants, so how do they use documentation? At a minimum, because of if they're an auditor, because they're required, they have to be able to read documentation, understand how a system works, and to do their job, they need to do the same. Evaluate, if you're an auditor, internal or external auditor, you need to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of internal control. A flow chart is a very good way to do that, particularly a document flow chart. It's a very good way to learn about the strengths and weaknesses of a control and to help maybe determine what new control processes need to be put in place. The documentation might also help them determine if a proposed system meets the needs of its users. That would be a systems flowchart. All right, so some reasons why we prepare documentation, how a new system would work, maybe to help train workers, and demonstrate our understanding of internal controls. As I mentioned, the authoritative literature does require, at a minimum, that accountants and auditors understand documentation. So SAS 94, Statement of Auditing Standard, promulgated by the ASCPA, requires auditors to understand the automated and manual procedures an entity uses. What better way than to look at a flowchart to understand those processes? SOX from 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, requires publicly traded companies and their auditors to document internal control and to test internal control standards. And then sort of from SOX is this auditing standard number 2 from the PCAOB, which requires you to express an opinion on the client's system of internal controls. So SOX really wanted you to document and test the controls. Then PCAOB wanted to step further and say, hey, we want you to attest to it and write a report on that, whether or not that, give an opinion on whether or not that internal control for the company that you're auditing is effective or not. And we'll talk a lot more about SOX when we get to Chapter 5. Some documentation types, system flowcharts, sort of beyond the purview of this course, but understanding the physical system activities. So what types of storage are we using? Tape or disk or offline or cloud? What types of processes are we using for processing our payroll or processing our accounts payable? What type of edit checks are we using? So it's sort of complex. It looks at what is going on in the system. It's sort of beyond what we do in here. But if you took a systems analysis course, it certainly would be something that you would evaluate and look at. DFDs provide a graphical picture of logical flow of data with an organization. So data is important to us. In this course, we're going to do a lot with access. We're doing a lot with this chapter with flowcharts and data. So we're going to look at a DFD and see the logical flow of data. How does it flow through an organization? DFD is very good at visualizing that for you. Document flowcharts examine source documents like checks, invoices, payroll checks, and then the processing of those documents. A lot of the processing, by the way, are manual processes within a document flowchart. So, and here's where we look at internal control. So is there a proper separation of functions? If we're processing, say, accounts receivable transaction, are we sure that someone does not have custody of cash and custody of recording, right? If they're recording cash and then they have the cash as well, and they're depositing in the bank, that could be a problem. They may receive 80, but only deposit 50 and record 50. And then business process charts or diagrams show the activities the company engages in to do business, so to do their processes. And so this is a good way to improve processes, and it's also a way to look at internal control within those processes that we're evaluating. All right, so DFD, we're going to look at that now. Graphically describes the flow of data within an organization. It's used to document existing systems and plan and design new systems. There's no one way to develop a DFD, but we're going to just kind of go through a step-by-step approach in the next few slides. So here's an example of a DFD, and this would be from your textbook, and this is a level 0 DFD. So it has two processes: process payments and updating accounts receivable. So that's within those circles. The lines would arrows with lines or the arrows contain your data. So I have customer payment, I have remittance data, I have receivable information, I have a deposit, so a deposit slip. The squares would be sources or destinations. So customer looks like a source, bank is a destination, credit manager is a destination, and accounts receivable is a file. And it's a file if it looks like a square but doesn't have sides. It doesn't have any vertical lines. It only has horizontal lines. So this would be an example of a file. So this would be the accounts receivable master file. So 4 basic elements: data sources and destinations. So that would be the customer would be a data source, credit manager, bank would be destination. Data flows would be customer payment, remittance data, so forth. Transformation processes would be these circles. We have 2 processes: process payment and update the account receivable master file. And then finally data stores, which would be updating right to our account receivable master file. All right, so data source and destinations. An item can be both a source and a destination. It appears as a square. Represent organizations or individuals that send or receive data produced by the system. So customer, the bank, and the credit manager. The customer is a source. Bank and credit manager are destinations. Data flows appear as arrows, and that's the data flow between our sources, destinations, process, and data storage, shown by an arrow. So I've got a customer payment, a check, right? And remittance. I've got remittance data, which would be the turnaround document that we use to update AR, not the check. I've got receivable information. After I update AR, there might be some kind of paper that tells me how much was, or maybe a report that tells me how many receivables were updated today or for the week. And then I have a deposit slip that I use to deposit money in the bank, cash in the bank. As you probably surmised from the slides, if data flow is a two-way, we use a bi-directional arrow. So we did have one up here for our file. We're reading from the file, but we're also writing to the file, and that's why it's bi-directional. But this could be bi-directional as well. I mean, for instance, customer sends us a payment, and when we send him an acknowledgement, the acknowledgement would be the documentation going back to that customer. So that could be bi-directional too. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be a file. That's bi-directional. Process appears circles, and that's the transformation of data. So we have 2 different transformations: the process payment and update AR. So you must need one inflow. In order to process something, you need at least one inflow, and then there should be an outflow. So there's an inflow, we processed it, then there should be an outflow coming from that process. So we use the remittance data, and we update the AR, and then we have maybe a little receivable report that we send over to the credit manager that the AR program does for us. The AR updating program will do for us. Data stores, 2 horizontal lines, temporary or permanent repository of data. For our DFD or data flow diagram, the AR is the AR master file. Okay. A data dictionary basically gives us information about each of these entities. Customer, so for instance, customer might be our primary key if we're using a database. So we would have that in our data dictionary. So it just tells us about all the data that we're collecting. All right, so data flow labeled student information might contain elements such as name, date of birth, ID, number, address, phone number, and major. So the data dictionary will contain information about all of these fields. We'll talk a lot more about data dictionaries in the next chapter. All right, here's your DFD assignment. You just need to basically repeat these 2 DFDs. Here's your context DFD, and here's your level 0. You just need to prepare those, and it should be similar to what I have here. As I mentioned earlier, I would use PowerPoint. Just click Insert and then Shape, and you'll easily be able to recreate these 2 documents. All right, you can also use Word or Visio. I would recommend, though, using PowerPoint. That's my little lecture for today, short and sweet. I will. There's also a lecture on the manual system, so take a look at that if you're having difficulty with that. And I'll talk to you during the week on email and through our discussion forums. Have a good week, everybody.